Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. The storm arrived without warning, as they always did in that forgotten corner of the Caribbean. The sky turned the color of old bruises, purple and black, swirling with a fury that seemed almost personal. The wind howled across the water like a chorus of the damned, whipping the waves into mountains of foam and salt. On the highest point of the nameless island, perched on jagged rocks that jutted from the sea like broken teeth, stood the lighthouse. Its beam cut through the darkness with mechanical persistence, sweeping across the churning water in slow, deliberate arcs. Inside, an old woman moved with practiced efficiency, her weathered hands checking the oil reservoir, adjusting the lens, ensuring the light would not falter. She had no name that anyone remembered. The few sailors who knew of this place called her simply the grandmother of the lighthouse, and that was enough. She was as much a fixture of this island as the rocks themselves, as constant as the tides. Her face was a map of years lived in solitude, deep lines carved by wind and salt, eyes the pale blue of shallow water over sand. Her hair, white as the foam on the waves, was pulled back in a tight bun that never seemed to come loose, no matter how fierce the wind. She wore the same thing every day, a dark woolen dress that had been patched so many times it was difficult to say what the original fabric had been, and over it, a gray shawl that she clutched close when she ventured outside. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat adjacent to the tower, a small stone structure with a sloped roof and windows that rattled in their frames whenever the wind picked up. Inside, it was sparse, but clean. A narrow bed with a quilt she had sewn herself, a wooden table with 2 chairs, though she never had visitors, a cast-iron stove that she kept burning, more for comfort than warmth in the humid climate, shelves lined with jars of preserves, dried fish, flour, and salt. Everything she needed to survive and nothing more. She had lived here for 43 years. She had come as a young woman, following her husband who had taken the keeper's position with dreams of a peaceful life. He had died in the 2nd year, swept off the rocks during a routine maintenance check when a rogue wave caught him unaware. They had never found his body. She had taken over his duties without question, and the maritime authority, stretched thin across 1,000 islands, had simply allowed it to continue. She had never left. There were no boats on the island, no way to leave even if she had wanted to. Once every 3 months a supply ship would anchor in the small cove on the leeward side, unload crates of provisions, and depart without ceremony. The captain would sometimes shout a greeting from the deck, but he never came ashore. She preferred it that way. The storm intensified as night fell. Rain lashed against the windows with a sound like thrown gravel. The sea rose up, waves crashing against the base of the rocks with such force that she could feel the vibrations through the stone floor. She had weathered hundreds of storms like this. They no longer frightened her. She was checking the stove, adding another log to keep the fire steady, when she heard something unusual. At first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, creating phantom sounds in the chaos. But then it came again, more clearly. Voices, men's voices, rough and urgent, cutting through the storm, and then, unmistakable, the pounding of fists against her door. She straightened slowly, her joints protesting. Visitors were rare. Visitors during a storm were unheard of. She moved to the window and pulled back the worn curtain, peering into the darkness. Through the sheets of rain, illuminated by the sweeping lighthouse beam, she could see them. Men, many men. They were huddled against the door, soaked to the bone, their clothes in tatters. Some were leaning on others, barely standing. Beyond them, barely visible through the storm, she could make out the dark shape of a ship, listing badly in the cove, its masts broken, sails torn to shreds. The pounding came again, more desperate this time. She hesitated for only a moment. Then she crossed to the door, drew back the heavy bolt, and pulled it open. The wind nearly tore it from her hands. The men stumbled inside, bringing with them the smell of the sea, of sweat and blood and desperation. She counted them quickly. 15. 15 men, all of them in various states of exhaustion and injury. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-eyed with hunger and exposure. Their clothes marked them for what they were: corsairs, privateers, Men who lived on the edges of the law, taking what they needed from those who had it. She had heard stories of such men all her life. They were supposed to be dangerous, violent, ruthless. These men looked broken. Abuela, one of them said, the Spanish word coming out as a rasp. He was younger than the others, perhaps 25, with dark eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Por favor, we mean no harm. Our ship, the storm. He gestured weakly toward the door. She said nothing. She simply stepped aside and gestured toward the interior of the cottage. They filed in slowly, moving like men in a dream, hardly daring to believe their fortune. Some collapsed immediately onto the floor. Others stood swaying, too exhausted to do more. She closed the door against the storm and turned to assess them properly. Several had injuries. A badly wrapped wound on one man's arm, another with a gash across his forehead still seeping blood. All of them were skeletal, their skin stretched tight over bones. They had been starving for some time. Without a word, she moved to her shelves. She pulled down jars of preserves, a wheel of hard cheese she had been saving, dried fish, flour. She stoked the fire in the stove and set her largest pot over the flame, filling it with water from the barrel by the door. She added potatoes, carrots, the dried fish, herbs from her garden that hung in bunches from the ceiling. The men watched her in silence, disbelief written on every face. One of them, an older man with gray in his beard and a voice that carried authority, spoke up. "Senora, you don't have to—" She cut him off with a sharp look and a gesture that needed no translation. "Be quiet and sit down." He obeyed. As the broth began to bubble, filling the small cottage with the smell of cooking food, she cut thick slices of bread from the loaf she had baked that morning. She had been planning to make it last the week. Now she gave it freely, moving among the men, pressing bread into their shaking hands. Some of them wept as they ate. She brought out her husband's old clothes from a trunk, garments she had kept for 40 years without knowing why. Shirts, trousers, woolen socks. She distributed them to the men whose clothes were beyond saving. She tore strips from an old sheet and cleaned wounds, her movements efficient and sure. She had tended to her husband's injuries often enough. The work came back to her easily. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside the cottage there was warmth and the quiet sounds of men eating, of bodies slowly remembering what it felt like to be cared for. They spoke little. Exhaustion claimed most of them quickly, and they slept where they sat. Some slumped against the walls, others stretched out on the floor. She moved among them in the lamplight, covering them with blankets, making sure each one was as comfortable as possible. The young one with the scar watched her for a long time before sleep took him too. Just before dawn, the storm finally broke. The wind died to a whisper, and the rain faded to nothing. The sea, still rough, began to calm. She stood at the window, watching the sky lighten from black to gray to the pale gold of morning. Behind her, the men slept on. She had given them everything she had, her food, her warmth, her care. She expected nothing in return. That was not why she had done it. When the sun finally crested the horizon, burning off the last of the fog, she looked out toward the sea and stopped breathing. The water was filled with ships, not just one or two, dozens, a fleet. They rode at anchor in a perfect crescent formation around the island, their dark sails furled, their guns run out but pointing skyward in salute. Flags flew from every mast, the colors of a dozen different nations, the personal standards of captains and crews. And at the center, the largest ship she had ever seen, a 3-masted man-of-war with gilt decorations that caught the morning light like fire. On every deck, men stood at attention, facing the lighthouse, facing her cottage. The young corsair with the scar had woken. He stood beside her now, looking out at the fleet, and on his weathered face was something she had not seen the night before. Pride. "They came for us," he said softly. "Our brothers. When we didn't return, they came searching." He turned to look at her and his eyes were bright. "And now they will see what you have done." The morning light transformed the sea into a sheet of hammered silver. The old woman stood at her window, still as stone, watching the impossible fleet that had materialized with the dawn. Behind her, the 15 corsairs were waking, stirring from their places on the floor, groaning as stiff muscles protested movement. The young one with the scar, whose name she had learned was Miguel, stood beside her with his hand pressed against the window frame, his breath fogging the glass. "San Cristobal," he whispered, his voice filled with something between reverence and disbelief. The flagship, Captain Rodrigo himself. The older corsair with the gray beard pushed himself to his feet, wincing as his joints cracked. He moved to the window, and when he saw the fleet, his weathered face split into a grin that showed several missing teeth. Madre de Dios, he breathed. They thought we were dead. The grandmother said nothing. She had lived 43 years in silence, broken only by the rhythm of the waves and the turning of the lighthouse. Words had become unnecessary things, and she had learned long ago that men would say what needed to be said without her help. She turned from the window and began to move through the cottage, gathering the bowls from the night before, checking which men still needed tending. One had developed a fever during the night, his forehead hot to the touch. She brought cool water and a cloth, pressing it against his skin with practiced gentleness. Outside she could hear activity. Boats were being lowered from the ships, oars cutting through the water. They were coming ashore. Miguel touched her shoulder gently, his scarred face serious. Abuela, he said softly, they will want to meet you, to thank you. Captain Rodrigo, he is not a man who forgets debts. She looked at him with those pale blue eyes that had watched 1,000 storms, and she shook her head once firmly. She wanted no thanks. She had done what any decent person would do, but even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. Most people would have barred their door against 15 armed corsairs in the night. Most people would have hidden, prayed the storm would drive them away. She had fed them instead. The sound of boots on rock announced the arrival of the landing party. There was a sharp knock at the door, commanding but respectful. The gray-bearded corsair, who Miguel called Santos, moved to answer it. When he pulled it open, the morning light flooded in, and with it came a man who could only be Captain Rodrigo. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair pulled back and a face that was handsome in the way of men who had seen too much but survived it all. He wore a long coat of deep blue, trimmed with gold, and at his hip hung a sword with an ornate hilt. Behind him stood a dozen men, all armed, all watching with the alertness of those who lived by violence. Rodrigo's eyes swept the interior of the cottage, taking in his men sprawled across the floor, the empty bowls, the clothes drying by the fire. Then his gaze found the grandmother and he stopped. For a long moment he simply looked at her. Then, slowly, deliberately, he removed his hat and dropped to one knee. Every man behind him did the same. The gesture was so unexpected, so theatrical, that even the grandmother felt something stir in her chest. Not pride, something else. Something she had not felt in many years. "Señora," Rodrigo said, and his voice was deep, resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "My men tell me you opened your door in the storm, that you fed them when they were starving, that you tended their wounds and asked nothing in return." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to something quieter, more personal. "I am told you gave them everything you had." She said nothing. What could she say? Rodrigo rose to his feet and his eyes never left hers. "We are not good men," he said simply. "We have taken much and given little. We have lived by the sword and the gun, and we have made enemies of empires." He gestured toward his men, toward the fleet beyond. "But we know honor when we see it, and we know a debt when we owe one." He reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy leather purse. The clink of gold was unmistakable. He held it out to her. She looked at the purse, then at his face, and she shook her head. Rodrigo blinked, clearly not expecting refusal. "Señora, please, you must accept." She shook her head again, more firmly this time, and pointed toward the door, not to drive them away, but to indicate the sea, the ships, the world beyond her small island. She made a gesture with her hands. "Take it away. Give it to someone who needs it." Miguel stepped forward, translating what she could not say. "She doesn't want payment, Captain. She did it because it was right." Rodrigo stood very still. Then slowly a smile spread across his face. It was not the smile of a pirate or a corsair. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten that such people existed in the world. "Then we will honor her in another way," he said. He turned to his men. "Spread the word through the fleet. Every captain, every crew. From this day forward, this island is protected. Any man who sails under our colors, any man who calls himself brother to this company, will know this place as sacred ground. The light that burns here will never be extinguished. The woman who tends it will never want for anything." He looked back at the grandmother. "And any man who raises a hand against her, or this place, will answer to me personally." The grandmother felt something unfamiliar prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked it away, nodded once, and turned back to her work. There was still a man with fever who needed tending, still bowls to wash, still a lighthouse that needed oil. Rodrigo watched her for a moment longer, then replaced his hat and gestured to his men. Make sure she has everything she needs. Food, medicine, tools. Strip the cargo holds, if you must. And send word to every port, every tavern, every place where sailors gather. The grandmother of the lighthouse is under our protection. As the corsairs began to file out, organizing the transfer of supplies, Miguel lingered. He approached the grandmother one last time and took her weathered hand in both of his. Gracias, abuela, he whispered. You saved more than our lives last night. She squeezed his hand once, gently, and released him. Then she returned to her patient, to her work, to her life. Outside, the fleet remained at anchor, a dark promise on the bright water. The island transformed over the following days. What had been a forgotten speck of rock in an empty sea became something else entirely. A way station, a sanctuary, a legend in the making. The corsairs worked with the efficiency of men who had spent their lives at hard labor. They unloaded crates from the cargo holds of their ships, hauling them up the steep path to the lighthouse cottage. Sacks of flour and rice, barrels of salted pork and dried fruit, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, jars of honey and preserves. They brought medicine too. Bandages and salves, bottles of rum for disinfecting wounds, packets of herbs whose names the grandmother did not know, but whose uses she quickly learned. They repaired the cottage roof where it had begun to leak, replaced warped floorboards, reinforced the door. They cleaned the lighthouse lens until it gleamed, restocked the oil reserves, and fixed the mechanism that had been grinding and stuttering for years. A team of carpenters built her a new dock in the cove, sturdy and well anchored, so that supply ships would no longer have to risk the rocks. They brought her chickens in wooden cages and goats that bleated indignantly as they were carried ashore, and they built pens to keep them safe from the wind. One crew even carried up soil in baskets and expanded her garden, planting vegetables and herbs that would thrive in the salt air. The grandmother watched all of this with a mixture of bemusement and something that might have been pleasure. She had lived so long in scarcity, rationing everything, making do with less, that the abundance felt almost obscene. But she did not refuse it. She understood in her quiet way that this was not charity. It was tribute. It was their way of maintaining honor in a dishonorable world. Captain Rodrigo came ashore each day, overseeing the work, speaking with his men, and always at some point he would find his way to wherever the grandmother was working. He never stayed long. He would simply watch her for a moment, as if trying to understand something that eluded him, and then nod respectfully and return to his ship. On the fourth day, as the work was nearing completion, he approached her as she scattered feed for the chickens. The birds clucked and strutted around her feet, already growing comfortable in their new home. "Señora," he said, and she turned to face him. "I wanted you to know. The word is spreading. Every port from Havana to Kingston, from Cartagena to New Orleans, men are talking about what happened here." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They are saying that the grandmother of the lighthouse fed the hungry and asked nothing in return. They are saying that she showed mercy to men who deserved none. Some are calling it a miracle." She frowned at that, shaking her head. There had been no miracle, only bread and broth and common decency. But Rodrigo smiled. "I know. You do not see it that way. But stories take on lives of their own, Señora. And this story, it is a good one. In a world of darkness, it is a light." He gestured toward the lighthouse, its beam still visible even in daylight, a faint pulse against the sky. Just like that. Over the following weeks, ships began to arrive. Not corsair vessels, but merchant ships, fishing boats, even a Royal Navy frigate that anchored respectfully at a distance and sent a lieutenant ashore with a case of tea and a letter of thanks from an admiral who had once been guided safely through a storm by the lighthouse beam. Each visitor brought gifts: food, tools, cloth, books. They would come ashore, leave their offerings at the cottage door, and depart without expecting to see her. Many never did. She had become something more than a woman now. She had become a symbol. The grandmother found this deeply uncomfortable. She had not changed. She still woke before dawn to tend the light. She still worked her garden, fed her animals, mended her clothes. She still lived in silence, measuring her days by the rhythm of the tides. But the world had changed around her. The supply ship captain, who had never come ashore in all the years before, now made a point of visiting her personally, bringing letters from people she had never met, thanking her for kindnesses she had never performed. Sailors would sometimes come ashore just to see the cottage, to stand outside and look at the place where the miracle had happened. She began to understand that the story had grown beyond the truth, had become something larger and stranger. In taverns and brothels, in the grand houses of merchants and the cramped quarters of ship's crews, men spoke of the grandmother of the Lighthouse, who had fed an army of corsairs with a single loaf of bread, who had healed mortal wounds with a touch, who had commanded the storm itself to cease. None of it was true, but truth, she was learning, mattered less than meaning. Miguel returned 1 month after the fleet had departed. He came alone in a small boat, rowing himself ashore in the early morning. She was outside, hanging laundry on a line that the corsairs had strung between 2 posts, when she saw him climbing the path. He had filled out since she had last seen him, no longer skeletal, his face healthier. The scar on his jaw seemed less prominent somehow, as if good food and rest had softened it. "Abuela," he called out, and she smiled. It was a small expression, barely there, but it was genuine. He embraced her carefully, as if she might break, and she patted his back with one weathered hand. "I had to come back," he said when he released her. "I had to see you again, to make sure you were real." They sat together on the bench outside the cottage, looking out at the sea. Miguel told her about the places he had been, the ports he had seen, the stories he had heard about her. He told her that in Tortuga, there was a tavern that had painted a mural of her on the wall, an old woman with a lamp in one hand and bread in the other, surrounded by kneeling men. He told her that in Port Royal, a brothel madam had started feeding the poor once a week, claiming she had been inspired by the tale. He told her that Captain Rodrigo had turned down a commission from the Spanish crown to raid English shipping, saying he would no longer take work that involved harming the innocent. "You changed us, Abuela," Miguel said quietly. "Not just the 15 who came to your door. All of us. Every man who heard the story." She looked at him with those pale blue eyes and slowly shook her head. She had changed nothing. They had changed themselves. But Miguel smiled. "Maybe. But you showed us it was possible, that there was still something in the world worth being better for." He stayed for 3 days, helping her with repairs, talking to her even though she rarely answered, filling the silence with his presence. When he left, he pressed something into her hand, a small carved wooden bird, wings spread in flight, polished smooth. "So you remember," he said, "that we were here, that it mattered." After he had rowed away, she stood on the rocks and watched his boat become a speck on the horizon. Then she went inside and placed the carved bird on the windowsill, where the light would touch it every morning. The seasons turned. Summer gave way to autumn, autumn to winter, winter to spring. The ships continued to come, though less frequently now. The story was settling into legend, becoming part of the mythology of the sea. She heard, through the supply ship captain, that someone had written a song about her, that priests were using her tale in sermons about mercy, that children in coastal villages were being told to be like the grandmother of the Lighthouse when they grew up. She did not know what to make of any of it. She had fed some hungry men during a storm. That was all. Everything else was what people had made of it, the meanings they had imposed, the lessons they had drawn. But on quiet nights when the lighthouse beam swept across the dark water and the wind sang through the rocks, she would sometimes allow herself to think about that morning when she had opened her door to find the fleet at anchor, the impossible sight of all those ships paying tribute to a single act of kindness. And she would think about Miguel's words, that she had shown them it was possible. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. The light continued to burn, night after night, guiding ships through the darkness, and the grandmother continued to tend it, as she always had, as she always would, until the day came when someone else would need to take up the work. But that day was not yet. For now there was oil to check and glass to clean and a lamp to keep burning. For now, there was the sea and the sky and the endless turning of the light. For now, there was enough. 3 years passed like the turning of tides. The grandmother grew older, as all people do, but she grew older in comfort now, surrounded by abundance she had never known. The garden flourished. The chickens laid eggs faithfully. The goats provided milk and cheese. The lighthouse burned without fail, its mechanism smooth and reliable after the Corsair's repairs. Ships still came, though the fervor had cooled into something quieter, more reverent. Captains would anchor offshore and send boats with supplies, with letters, with small gifts. Some would ask permission to come ashore, to meet her, to shake her hand. She allowed it occasionally, though she never grew comfortable with the attention. She remained what she had always been, a keeper of the light, nothing more. But the world insisted on seeing her as something else. In the ports and cities of the Caribbean, her story had woven itself into the fabric of maritime culture. Sailors touched talismans bearing her image before embarking on dangerous voyages. Mothers named their daughters after her, though they used different names since no one knew her real one. Songs and poems multiplied, each version adding new embellishments, new miracles, new meanings. The truth had become irrelevant. The legend was what mattered. On a morning in early autumn, when the air had begun to carry the first hints of the changing season, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was not a Corsair vessel or a merchant trader. It was a sleek schooner, fast and well-maintained, flying no flag she recognized. She watched it anchor in the cove, watched the boat lower, watched a single figure row ashore. As the person climbed the path toward the lighthouse, she realized with some surprise that it was a woman. Young, perhaps 30, with dark hair bound in a practical braid and clothing that spoke of both wealth and function. She moved with confidence, carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder. When she reached the cottage, she stopped and looked at the grandmother with eyes that were intelligent and appraising. "Señora," she said in Spanish, then switched to English. "Ma'am, my name is Isabel Cortez. I've come a very long way to meet you." The grandmother gestured toward the bench, an invitation. Isabel sat, setting her satchel carefully beside her. For a moment, she simply looked out at the sea as if gathering her thoughts. "I'm a cartographer," she said finally. "I make maps, charts for ships, coastal surveys, navigation guides. It's how I make my living." She turned to look at the grandmother. "And in every port I visit, in every sailor's tavern and captain's quarters, I hear stories about you, about this place, about what happened here 3 years ago." The grandmother said nothing, but Isabel seemed to expect that. "I wanted to know if the stories were true, so I started investigating. I tracked down some of the men who were here that night. I spoke with Miguel Torres, the young one with the scar. I spoke with Santos Delgado, the gray-bearded one. I even managed to get an audience with Captain Rodrigo himself." She paused. "They all told me the same thing, that you saved their lives, that you asked for nothing, that you changed them." Isabel reached into her satchel and withdrew a rolled piece of parchment. She unrolled it carefully, revealing an exquisitely detailed map of the Caribbean. The grandmother leaned closer, studying it. Islands and coastlines were rendered in precise detail, depth soundings marked in careful script, currents and wind patterns indicated with elegant symbols. And there, marked with a small illustration of a lighthouse and surrounded by decorative flourishes, was her island. Beneath it, in elaborate calligraphy, were the words, "Isla de la Abuela, sacred ground, all are welcome." "I've been making copies of this map," Isabel said quietly, "distributing them to every captain, every navigator, every maritime office that will take one. I wanted to make sure that what happened here is never forgotten, that this place is protected, not just by the word of Corsairs, but by official recognition." The grandmother reached out and touched the map gently, her weathered fingers tracing the outline of her island. Isabel watched her carefully. "There's something else," she said. "Something I think you should know. The story of what you did here. It's spreading beyond the Caribbean. I've heard versions of it in Boston, in London, in Lisbon. People are talking about mercy and kindness in a world that often has little of either. Some are using it for politics, yes, and some are using it for religion, but others—" She trailed off, then continued. "Others are using it as permission to be better than they were. I've met merchants who've started treating their crews more fairly. I've met sailors who've stopped drinking themselves to death. I've met a former slaver who freed his human cargo and turned to honest trade, because he said if an old woman could show mercy to pirates, he could stop being a monster." The grandmother looked at Isabel for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. She had not done these things. She had not changed these people. They had changed themselves. But Isabel smiled, and it was a sad, knowing smile. "I know. You don't feel responsible for any of it. You just did what felt right in the moment. But that's exactly why it matters so much. Because it wasn't calculated. It wasn't for reward or recognition. It was just good, pure good, in a world that doesn't see much of it. She rolled up the map and returned it to her satchel. I won't take up more of your time. I just wanted you to know that your light, she gestured toward the lighthouse, is guiding more than just ships now. It's guiding people, showing them that there's another way to live. She stood, shouldering her satchel. The grandmother stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other. Then Isabel did something unexpected. She embraced the old woman, carefully and respectfully, and whispered, "Thank you for reminding us what we could be." After Isabel had departed, rowing back to her ship with strong, steady strokes, the grandmother returned to her work. There was always work. The light needed tending. The garden needed watering. The animals needed feeding. The ordinary, endless tasks of living. But as she worked, she found herself thinking about what Isabel had said, about lights that guided more than ships, about mercy that rippled outward, touching shores she would never see. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She had never asked for legend or reverence. She had simply opened her door on a stormy night and fed some hungry men. Everything else had been the world's doing, not hers. But perhaps, she thought as she climbed the spiral stairs to check the lighthouse lamp, perhaps that was how all change began. Not with grand gestures or elaborate plans, but with small acts done without thought of consequence. A door opened, a meal shared, a wound tended. Simple things that became complicated only in the retelling. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The sea had calmed to gentle swells, its surface reflecting the colors above. She lit the lamp and adjusted the lens, and the beam began its eternal rotation, cutting through the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there, ships were navigating by that light. Captains were checking their charts and marking their positions, grateful for the steady beacon that helped them find their way. And perhaps in some tavern or cabin or quiet moment of conscience, someone was telling the story again, changing it, embellishing it, adding new meanings. Perhaps someone was hearing it for the first time and thinking about their own choices, their own capacity for mercy or cruelty. Perhaps the story was doing its work, whatever that work might be. The grandmother completed her inspection and descended the stairs. In the cottage, she prepared a simple meal, bread and cheese, tea with honey, an egg from her chickens. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for abundance, but not dependent on it. She had lived through scarcity before. She could do so again if she had to, but she hoped she wouldn't have to. After cleaning up, she sat by the window with the carved wooden bird on the sill beside her. Miguel had never returned after that first visit, but she heard about him occasionally through other visitors. He had become a captain himself now, leading his own crew, and the stories said he was fair and generous, quick to help those in need. She liked to think that was true. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the darkness in its patient rhythm. One rotation, then another, endless and unchanging. She had tended this light for 46 years now. How many more did she have? 5? 10? 20? It didn't matter. She would tend it until she couldn't anymore, and then someone else would take over. The light would continue. That was what mattered. As she sat in the quiet cottage, surrounded by gifts from strangers and ghosts of the past, the grandmother allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about her husband, swept away by the sea so many years ago. She thought about the young woman she had been, the life she had imagined, the dreams that had died with him. She thought about the storms she had weathered, the ships she had guided, the endless solitary years. And she thought about one night 3 years ago, when 15 desperate men had knocked on her door and she had let them in. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time. It still seemed like a small thing. But perhaps small things were all that anyone really had. Perhaps the grand narratives and sweeping changes were always built from small things. A meal shared, a kindness offered, a light kept burning in the darkness. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything. The night deepened. The beam continued its rotation. And the grandmother of the lighthouse, whose real name no one remembered and who had become something larger than herself without ever asking for it, closed her eyes and rested. Tomorrow there would be work. Tomorrow there would be the light to tend, the animals to feed, the garden to care for. Tomorrow there would be the ordinary business of living. But tonight, there was only this: the sound of the sea, the warmth of the cottage, the steady turning of the light. Tonight, there was peace, and in the darkness of the Caribbean night, guided by a beam that had burned for nearly half a century, ships found their way home safely. Sailors marked their charts and whispered thanks, and somewhere, in some distant port, someone told the story again, adding their own flourishes, their own meanings, their own hopes. The legend grew, the light endured, and the woman who had started it all slept peacefully, having done nothing more extraordinary than choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier. In the end, perhaps that was the only miracle that mattered.